One of the most overlooked skills in a developer's toolbox is the ability to find and fix problems. Too often, new developers avoid learning to diagnose problems because they want to get back to real programming. But the reality is, you'll probably spend more time debugging problems than you will building new applications. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps I go through every time I fix an error. If you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. This channel is full of videos explaining the various parts of C#. There's even a course on building an application from scratch on here. I hope you find these videos useful. And if you do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell icon to get notified when I release a new video every Monday. There's also a link to my mailing list that you can sign up for in the description below. That'll keep you informed of all the training resources I'm creating. For those of you who have found my content valuable, I'd appreciate it if you check out my Patreon page. If you become a supporter, you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes access. Also, everyone who's a supporter at any level will get access to the goal rewards when we hit them. Those rewards include a tour of my office, a documentary on how I make videos, and even a full course. The link to Patreon is in the description below. All right, so let's tackle debugging. Now I'm going to start us off with an application that is bad. So just know that this is not an application I am recommending you use. In fact, there's a whole, if you notice at the top here of this application, there's a whole big statement that says, don't use this, don't look at this as an example of anything other than a bad application. So that's just out of the way. But if you want this starter application, there's a link in the description where you can go and download the code as it stands right now, as well as it's going to stand at the end of this video. So there's a link to my blog that'll have both a starting code and the end code. Okay, so what I've done is I've created a console application, and I've tried to simulate what you'd find in the real world. Okay, so on this channel, we talk a lot about best practices, about doing things right, and planning before you build, and all those kind of great things that seem to go by the wayside when you're in the real world, if you're not careful. And so typically what happens is you'll start at a company, and you don't start by building a new application. You start by maintaining something that's been built over years. And you come in and it's kind of a mess. And while this is not an actual application I've found in the real world, this does reflect an awful lot of what I've seen in the real world. So this is a console application. And if you notice, the first thing right off the bat is everything's all jumbled together. And there's actually even down here a new class right in our program.cs. So it's a console application, really simple, except for the fact there's another class in here. We've got all this stuff kind of bunched up. It looks like we've got some repeat stuff in here. It's just kind of a mess. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to use this code twice for 2 different videos. So this video is all about debugging. So we're going to debug this and get the errors out as much as possible. And we should be able to get an application at the end that runs fairly smoothly. But we're not going to refactor this. We're just going to treat this like it's the real world. And in the real world, what happens is your boss says, we've got a bug in this application, you need to go fix it. And you look at the application and go, oh man, this is a mess. I'd love 2 weeks to refactor this thing. And your boss says, you have 15 minutes because it's broken in production. And so this is that first step in the process, which is just get that bug fixed. So we're not going to deal with making this a better application by refactoring it, just by making a better application as far as functional. In the next video, we'll talk about how to refactor this and actually go through and refactor it as well. I figure we could get, kind of dual usage out of this application. So let's first start by running the application and seeing how far we get. So I'll hit start. And right now it says enter what you did. All right, so this is a timesheet entry application, which is not real clear, and that's something you're going to find in the real world as well. Things that aren't real clear. But enter what you did. I worked for Acme Corp. How long do you do it for? I think 5 hours. Do you want to enter more time? No. String was not recognized as a valid boolean. Okay, so there's the first error we get. Now, this is where we're going to start stepping into the 5-step process for diagnosing and fixing errors. All right, so it's actually, I've put it into an acronym. So DRIFT, D-R-I-F-T. If you want to think of it in the acronym and try and remember it that way, that's fine. Otherwise, just remember the 5 steps. So the first step, don't panic. And this is the first step that usually people get wrong, is they go, oh no, and either they start changing code or they start Googling. Neither of those is appropriate yet. Let's start with take a breath. It's not the end of the world. Let's look at what's going on. And so the next step is read the error message. This is another thing that people often skip over. These error messages are here for a reason. They give you valuable information. Don't just say, I got an error. Read what it says. So, unhandled exception. That just means we haven't put this in error handler, like a try-catch. So that doesn't really tell us much, except we didn't plan for it. Next, we see this is a string or a system.format exception, which says string was not recognized as a valid boolean. Well, that actually tells us a lot about what we need to know. But if you're not quite sure what that means, don't just skip over it, think it through. String, whatever string that was not recognized as a valid boolean. So we have a string that we're trying to pass off as a boolean. A boolean is a true or a false. And that string is not a true or a false. Therefore, it's failing. Now, before we go on, there's this View Details button. If we click on this, there's a whole bunch of information in here, but one of those things is the inner exception. Now, in this case, we don't have an inner exception. But if we did, we have more information that might be valuable. The most valuable thing here usually, though, is this message. So if you find that there is an inner exception, open it up and look for its message as well and read that. So in this case, we don't have an inner exception, but the exception message is string was not recognized as a valid boolean. Okay, so where is this in the code? Well, it stops on line 29. So that's important. We'll kind of keep that in mind as we go forward and try to diagnose this. Now, before we do anything else, what I'll do is I'll close this out and I can start looking at the code. So, for example, I can mouse over different parts of this and read what the value is. So this variable is set to false. This bool.parse is passing in a console read line, which doesn't help me very much. But that's something to note as well. So now the next thing to do is identify the purpose of the code. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here. So we've not panicked. We've read the error message and understood it as best we can. And now it's time to identify the purpose of this code in particular. What is this doing? And maybe you have to have a little more context and kind of expand and say, what is this doing? But at least identify what this is doing, and if you have to, expand out to more lines above it. Well, right now, we know that the console write line says, do you want to enter more time? And I said no, NO. Well, it passed in, so the console read line, it read my NO and passed that into the bool.parse. Well, is that a true or a false value? It doesn't say true or false. So let's try something. And so that's the next step, is figure out what breaks the code. All right, so our error is on line 29. So if we can get past line 29, we know what doesn't break the code. And then we can figure out, okay, if we know what doesn't break the code, we kind of know what does break the code. So let's start this again. I worked for Acme, I worked for 5 hours. Do I want to enter more time? I know it needs a boolean, so let's say false. All right, so it says enter what you did, which if you notice is down on line 32. So I've bypassed this error or exception by passing in a false. Now the assumption is if I pass in a true, it will work as well. So that this first error to fix is whenever we pass in something that is not true or false. So now what we need to do is the final step in our 5-step process, which is try a new solution. Now I may do this multiple times if we don't get it right, but we know what breaks this. We also know what doesn't break this. So we'll make sure we test both of those things when we're trying this new solution. So let's figure out what a new solution could be. So the person who developed this trusted the user to know to type true or false, which seems unwise for a couple reasons. First of all, I didn't know that no wasn't a valid answer. I mean, that seems valid. Do you want to enter more time? If you asked me that question on the street, I would say yes or no. I wouldn't say true. That doesn't seem obvious. So maybe we could do is, in here we could say, true or false like this, but that seems awkward. And it also depends on the user giving us one of those two values. You know users, and you know my opinion on users. Users will always trip you up. You can never trust what they give you. So I don't like that solution. But what if instead of doing that, we had something else like this? And let's actually put some space here. Again, I hate this non-spacing thing. So I'm going to put some space here. Let's say string answer equals console.readline. And then we'll say, let's put our bool cont here, equals false. Let's default it to false. And instead of this line right here, we're going to say if answer equals, double equals, yes, all lowercase, and we'll make sure we do answer.toLower. If the answer is yes, cont equals true. All right, so what I've done here is, and I'm actually going to put in parens here, yes/no, but the difference between saying true/false and yes/no is I'm not reading that into trying to read it right into a boolean and try and convert it, or parse it into a boolean. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm reading it into a string, which is no conversion there. It just puts it right in a string, which also makes my debugging easier because now I can see that value before I try to use it. But what I'm doing is I'm setting the cont, which I assume is continue. I'm setting it to false. So I'm saying by default, we don't continue. But if you type YES, lowercase, uppercase, or combination, doesn't matter, then we'll say continue is true. So by default, it's going to stop instead of continuing unless they type yes. Okay? So this is kind of a more foolproof, hopefully, way of doing things. So let's see if we can't get this to run. So I worked for Acme. How long do you do that for? 5. Let's put a breakpoint afterwards. Let's put it right on a do loop right here. Because if we get past this section right here, we know that we've succeeded in this step of the process. Do you want to enter more time? I'm going to say false, which ironically is what would have worked. And I got past it, and cont is still set to false because the answer, notice I'm doing my debugging here. I'm mousing over my different variables, I can read their value. Answer was set to false. False.toLower does not equal yes, therefore we never set cont to true. All right, so it doesn't matter what we put in here. So tests, 5, enter more time. It doesn't matter, but let's put yes and see if it changes that value. In fact, I'll do the uppercase E. And down here, the cont is set to true because answer to lower is equal to yes. So that's good. We're working. Now, let's continue on our application and use it as we were. So let's start off with our information we had. I worked at Acme. I worked for 5 hours. Do you want to enter more time? No. Now here, it's not throwing an exception, but it seems like it's not doing what we expect it to do. It says enter what you did, which is question number 1 right here. So it seems like it's looped through, even though I said no to do you want to enter more time? Let's find out why. So, and maybe I should talk through the idea of what this application does, but we're kind of just learning it as we go. But essentially, you've got this list of timesheet where we're entering information. And each one of these is a timesheet entry, which is just work done and hours worked, which is an int. Okay, so that's all we're doing right now. We'll continue on and learn more about the application as we go. But for right now, that's all we really need to know. So when I say no here to do I want to enter more time, and it sets the cont to false, we don't want to continue. Well, why is it continuing? Well, here we have a do loop. Remember that a do loop executes at least once. And at the bottom, it's checking to see if cont equals true. So this is actually a pretty quick fix here. We know that it continues on no matter what and asks again. So let's cut this out. And instead of a do loop, we'll make it a while loop. Because a while loop executes 0 or more times, not 1 or more times. Now, as I'm reading, I also notice that, okay, that should fix the problem. We'll test that. But I also notice this console write line that looks an awful lot like what we had up here. We're going to address that in a minute, but I don't want to address that yet. And here's another important step of debugging. Don't change 5 things at once. Try and change one thing and see how it affects your work. If you change multiple things at once, you're never sure which one was the one that solved the problem or caused a different problem that looks like the first problem. So just change one thing at a time, and that way you're very clear on what you're doing. So even though I see a problem, I'm not going to fix it. All right, before I actually pull it over here, I'm going to put my breakpoint at the end of this while loop. Because in theory, if I say no, it should skip over this entire bit of code because cont will equal false. So if it's working, I'll get past this. So let's drag this over. Worked at Acme for 5 hours. No, I don't want to continue. And notice I hit my breakpoint. So this is another helpful thing breakpoints do, is they allow you to stop your application right when you know that you've gotten past the problem area. So that bit of code worked. All right, so before I continue, I know I have this other error, but I want to see it first. So I could fix it, but let's see it first to make sure it works the same way and responds the same way. So I'm going to run this again. I worked at Acme for 5 hours. Yes, I want to continue to enter more entries. What I do, I worked For ABC Corp, I worked for 4 hours. Do you want to enter more time? No. And there's our exception. Same one. String was not recognized as a valid Boolean. So again, the steps, don't panic. We're not, because we know what's going on. Read the error message? I did, because that's important that the error message is the same error message. Otherwise, it might be a different issue. Identify the purpose of the code. I think that's pretty clear that this is trying to populate this cont variable so that when it comes back up here, it may change to be true and get us out of the loop. All right, and we know what breaks the code. Anything other than saying true or false. And so let's try a new solution. So a new solution is actually very, very similar to what we have up here. We're going to do a console readline. Actually, I'll copy all this code. And I'm going to overwrite this line right here. And I'll take off the declaration because we already have declared these variables. We just need to reuse them. So the answer goes in, or the console readline goes into the answer variable. The answer to, do you want to enter more time? And then we set by default the continue to false, but change that to be true if the answer is yes. And again, that's too lower, so it can be any combination of capitalization or not. All right, and actually let's change the spacing here a little bit. That seems a little more reasonable. So let's run this again. I'll put my breakpoint at this line 57 right here, because if we get into this while loop and we say no, and we get out of this while loop, that's where we'll hit next. So what did I do? I worked at Acme. I worked for 5 hours. Yes. I worked at ABC Corp for 4 hours. Do you want to enter more time? This is in that while loop now, so I'll say no, which used to break it. Now we get right to this right here. Now, in order to save time, I'm just going to continue. And this is what we get. All right, so I stopped right here, entering information. And it says simulating sending email to Acme. Your bill is $0 for the hours worked. Simulating sending an email to ABC. Your bill is $125 for the hours worked. And you will get paid $90 for your time. Okay, so the application is continued through and is now done. But let's look at the bills. $0 for the hours worked for Acme, $125 for ABC, and $90 for me. Okay, let's remember those numbers. All right, so let's look at what the code does below this while loop. So it goes through a for loop, not a for each, a for. And it says if, and this is searching through the ents, which if we look up at the very top here, we see that ents is a list of timesheet entry. So every time we add an entry to, or every time we create a timesheet entry, we add it to the ents list. Naming is a very important thing. These names are awful, okay? This is one of the things you work through when you work through somebody else's code or a production application that's rushed. For right now, all we can do is understand what it's doing and then figure out how to fix the bugs. So we have this list of ents, which is all of our timesheet entries. In our case, 2 of them. And it loops through and it looks at each entry. So ent 0, ent 1, looks at it as work done property. All right, which work done, if you notice, is a string. That's where we say I worked at Acme, I worked at ABC Corp. So if work done contains Acme, which the first one did, I had 5 hours. All right, and it says TTL, which I believe is the total. That's, again, a horrible abbreviation, but it starts off at 0, and TTL plus equals 1. Okay? So it looks at that and says, add 1 to the total. And then it says, after we've done the for loop, it says, simulating sending an email to Acme, your bill is the TTL times 150 for the hours worked. Well, I had 5 hours worked for Acme, but I had $0. That doesn't seem right. So we found another bug that doesn't show itself as an exception, but instead as a calculation error. So let's run this again and see if we can get it to work. So I'll say I worked for Acme for 5 hours, and no, I'm not going to enter more time. And it still says that your bill is $0 for the hours worked. Let's find out why that is. Now, since this is not throwing an exception, I get to use breakpoints. And I say get to because breakpoints are an amazing tool. If you don't understand how breakpoints work, I have a whole video on that. But we're going to use some of the features of breakpoints. So let's put a breakpoint on line 58. And the reason I put it there is because I want to start before the calculation of how many, what this total is, because that's what is used for the multiplication of 150. So let's run this, and we'll put in our time. So I worked for Acme for 5 hours. No. And now it's hit our breakpoint. It doesn't take the window away necessarily all the time. It does sometimes. All right. So we're setting I to 0. I is our counter. And then we're saying I is less than ents.count. Well, that's 1. So it starts out at 0. So 0 is less than 1. So it will continue on. And it's going to add 1 every time we loop through this, which is fine. All right. So now I'm going to say if ents at position 0 is its work done, which it says I worked for Acme. Notice this is a newer feature of the debugger, that right now, even though I'm saying ents I, it knows that I is 0. Therefore, it knows the work done is for the item at position 0. So it gives me the work done, which is I worked for Acme. So it does contain the string Acme. Therefore, it should be flagged, or it should say, yes, that's true. Let's step into it. And in fact, it does go into the if statement, so that's working. So TTL, which is 0, plus equals I. Well, wait a minute. Why are we adding I to our total? We're looking for how many hours we worked at Acme because we take their hours and multiply it by 150. Not I. I is just our counter for which position we're at in our list. So we've not panicked. We didn't have an error message to read, so we didn't have to do that. We identify what the purpose of the code is, and we know what breaks the code, and that actually there's nothing broken here. It's just that it's not doing what we're intending it to do, which is we're intending it to add all of our hours together, but instead it's adding I, which the I at position 0 is 0. So therefore, 0 plus equals 0 is 0. Therefore, 0 times 150 is still 0. So let's try a new solution. So instead of adding I, we should be saying ents at position I, dot hours worked. And that should add 5 to our total. Let's run this and see if that's actually true. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. No. The bill now for Acme is $750. That is 5 times 150. Now, the interesting thing is, simulating sending email to ABC. We didn't do any hours for ABC. Your bill is $625. Now, wait a minute. Why would our bill for ABC be $625 if we didn't work for them? That makes no sense. So let's look at what the problem is here. We've identified another problem. All right, we won't panic. We don't have an error message to read, but we read the where the error was. Now let's identify the purpose of the code. So after our Acme calculation, we do a very, very similar for loop where we look for ABC. And there's that plus equal I. And that's not right because that means that we have our counter being used again as the hours worked. So we know what to do. We can change this counter to say int I dot hours worked. All right, so let's try this again. We won't change anything. We'll still just work at Acme. And I worked for 5 hours. No. And check that out. Simulating sending an email to ABC, your bill is $625. My fix didn't work. All right. Again, go back to step 1. Don't panic. Okay. You may go, oh no, and take the fix out because you think it didn't work. Stop. Don't just jump in and start making changes. Understand the code. So in this case, we're not quite sure why our fix, which worked up here, didn't work down here when it looks like these two are identical. All right? Or it's seemingly identical. And let's look and notice that this for loop has one line in it, just total plus equals hours worked. But in this for loop, we actually have an if statement first. If the work done, oops, I see a problem. I scrolled too far. And that's one of the reasons why duplicate code is a problem. I started debugging a section down here when it's really up here. So this code right here looks very, very similar to this code, and they both have an if statement. So that's not the issue. So what is the issue? Now you could guess, but there's an easier way to find out. Let's look at what the code actually looks like when it's running. So I'm going to put a breakpoint at this for loop. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. Now notice I'm not changing my entries that I'm doing. And the reason why I'm not changing that is because I want to keep this as similar as possible. So the only thing that changes is whatever I fix or tweak. That way I know specifically if that fix or tweak fixed the problem. Because maybe a different set of parameters works. Like remember when I said no and it crashed. But when I said false, it worked. Well, I don't want to keep switching up what I say because sometimes it may work and I may think that my code fixed the problem, but in reality, it's my parameters that changed. So let's keep that in mind. Don't vary your information at all. Try and keep it the same so you have the same results come back when you're testing. All right. Do you want to enter more time? No. So I'm at my breakpoint here. So let's start off I equals 0. I is less than ents.count, which is 1. So if ent 0, work done, I worked for Acme, contains ABC. It does not. Let's see if it's going to get flagged. That skips right over it and goes to the next in the for loop, which gets us right out because I is now equal to ents.count. So it didn't do any work here. So why is it that it is writing out our value incorrectly. Well, let's mouse over what it's going to write. TTL is 5. Well, how did TTL get to be 5? Now, if you're keeping track, that number might sound familiar. That's because that's what it was up in this for loop. We had 5 hours worked for Acme. So, why is it that TTL is still 5? That's because we never reset the value to 0 before this for loop. So now that we understand what breaks the code, let's try a new solution. TTL equals 0. Let's start over. Enter what you did. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. No. My Acme bill is $7.50. My ABC bill is 0. And I'll get paid $50 for my time, which is interesting because that used to say $100 for my time. So that's changed. Let's find out why. So let's go down here. We just fixed this right here. Notice how all this kind of clumping together makes it hard to read. And there's no debugging tips. There's no, comments. There's nothing to help you out to say, this is this section, this is that section. This is a really messy program. And I'd love to fix it all. I don't have time. That's not my job today. My job today is to fix the bug. The boss wants it out the door as soon as possible, which is not unreasonable because typically when you're fixing a bug for production. And the more time that a bug sits in production, the more customers it affects, the more revenue you lose. So it's definitely important to get bug fixes out as soon as possible. Even if this isn't in production yet, or they found a workaround until you can fix it, the faster you fix a problem, the less time you're spending working on fixing issues, the more time you can spend fixing or making new stuff. And so it's always a race to get bugs fixed as soon as possible. So you're not always going to have a lot of time, and most of the time you won't have any time to go back and kind of tweak things. Now, there is the idea of leaving things a little better than you found them. That's the Boy Scout principle. So we're going to do a little bit of that, but right now I'm really simulating the idea that we're just trying to rush through this thing and make it and fix it. So let's look at where this next potential issue is. We're not sure if it's an issue or not. Maybe this solved the problem, but something has changed that we didn't think should change. So we've read our code and walked through it down to here. So the next step is again a for loop, but it just has it loops through all the entries and it just adds the hours worked to TTL. And if TTL is greater than 40, then it says you'll get paid TTL times 15. Otherwise, you'll get paid TTL times 10. So what it's saying is, if you're more than 40 hours, you're going to get paid time and a half. And otherwise, you're going to get paid just your normal rate, essentially, which is assuming $10 an hour. All right? But why did that change? Well, we just learned a lesson here. Reset the total to 0. Where does TTL get set? It's not being reset to 0. Therefore, that's a problem. So let's go ahead and try out a solution. TTL equals 0. And again, let's put a break here to kind of separate our sections. This is one of those little cleanup things you can do to make things a little better, even though you're not really fixing this whole problem. So now the total should be 0, and it's going to loop through the entries. It is using hours worked, which is good, adding it to the total, and then it compares to see if a total is greater than 40 And if not, it says total times 10. So in our example, 10 times 5 is 50. That would be right. So we actually fixed a bug that we hadn't really seen yet. What I mean by that is when we put this total equals 0 up here before the ABC check, because there's no ABC, TTL is still 0. Therefore, when it came down here, even though we weren't setting it to 0 again, it was still 0, and so 0 plus equals 5, and that worked. But it would have been a problem if we had ABC also in here. Like if you had an ABC entry, that would not have worked. So that seems like it's working. And in fact, we can test this again by putting both an Acme and an ABC entry in here and making sure that this still calculates properly. So let's run this again. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. Yes. I worked for ABC Corp for 4 hours. No, I don't want to enter more time. So 5 hours for Acme, 4 hours for ABC. Acme, your bill is $0. That doesn't seem right. In fact, I know it's not right. ABC gets $1,000. That also does not seem right, because 4 hours at $125 an hour should be $500. And we get paid $80 for your time. I know that's not right, because 10 times 9 hours, 5 plus 4 is 9, is $90, not $80. So we just found out we've got a whole new set of bugs to work through. Okay? Again, not the time to panic. And this is another time when, if you're a new developer, you might kind of freak out a little bit. Don't. Just because you experience a bug doesn't mean it's the same bug. It's not. It's different now. That means that you have something else to work through. That doesn't mean that what you're doing so far isn't effective. Think of it like closing your windows in your car when it's raining. When you close one window, you solve a problem, but it doesn't feel like you've got a solution yet because the rain's still coming in. You have to close all the windows. And so one by one, you close windows. That doesn't mean when you close one window, you see this great success. And that's because the rain's still coming in. But don't worry, you are making progress. So as long as you're not seeing the exact same error, you're making progress. So we have fixed the problem we've seen so far. We're just going to fix more. So we know what the simulate or situation is that causes this issue. When we say we worked for Acme for 5 hours, ABC for 4 hours, and that's it. So we can assume that we can get down to here without a problem. Let's assume that we can get past the while loop without an issue. So let's run this and make sure. So I worked for Acme for 5 hours. Yes. I worked for ABC Corp for 4 hours. And no. All right. So we've gotten past that. Now, before we go on, I'm going to look at my ent's, which is my list of entries. And I have 2 of them. The bottom one, I always do the bottom one first because when this opens, notice when it opens up top, it's kind of hard to get to the second one. I know it's kind of small on the screen, sorry. I can't figure out a way to make these fonts bigger. So I start the bottom one. The bottom one says 4 hours for ABC Corp. The top one says 4 hours for ABC Corp. Well, that doesn't seem right. Okay, 4 hours ABC Corp is the bottom one. 4 hours ABC Corp is the top one. So I assumed that my problem was down here, down below where this breakpoint is. But it's not. It's actually above this. There's a problem somewhere up here that's causing me to record the wrong information in my list. So I could guess and I could try and read the code, but this code is written horribly. So let's instead step through the code. So let's start with line 24. I create a first timesheet entry. Okay, so what I did, I worked for Acme for 5 hours. All right, my breakpoint's been hit. And it says, let's create a new timesheet entry. Cool. Hours worked is T, which again, horrible name, but it says 5 hours. Cool. Work done is W, horrible name, but it says I worked for Acme. That's correct. So we're going to add this int, which is a timesheet entry, where it says 5 hours worked, I worked for Acme. That's all correct. We're going to add that to our ints, which currently has 0 in the list. Now, before I go on, I'm going to check ints. I have 1 entry in the list, and it says I worked for Acme for 5 hours. So it's all correct. Now it's going to say, do you want to enter more time and read from the console? So it's going to wait for me. I want to say, yes, I want to enter more time. And now it goes on in my debugging. So cont starts at false. The answer is yes. So yes to lower equals yes. So therefore, it's going to set the cont to true. And it's going to check in this while loop to make sure that continue is true. I'm going to say continue because cont just sounds weird and it's annoying. So continue is true. All right, so enter what you did and read line into W. W is right now saying I worked for Acme. So that's the variable, string variable we're going to use. Which, yes, it has a value in it currently, but the console read line overwrites it no matter what. So that's not horrible. It's not great, but it's not horrible. So I'll step into this. And I worked for ABC Corp. How long you do it for? And it's got an int.parse for console readline. We'll come back to that one because that seems dangerous. I worked for 4 hours. Hours worked equals T. All right. And T was 4, so now int.hours worked is 4. And work done is I worked for ABC Corp. That's right. So let's add this entry, which says I worked for ABC Corp for 4 hours. That's correct. Let's add that to our ints list, which currently only has 1, which is correct. Let's make sure that what that 1 is, and there's our problem. It says I worked for ABC Corp and 4 hours worked. But if you remember, before we went through this while loop, it said I worked for Acme for 5 hours. So this entry list has changed since we started this, and this is where the first time where we actually add something to the list. So how did the list change without us adding something to the list? So I think I have all the information I need to kind of read through. So I'm going to stop this code. If I wasn't sure if I could just keep it live, but I'm going to stop this because I think I see the problem here. So up here, we have timesheet entry, ent equals new timesheet entry. We fill it in and add to the list. Down here, we say ent.hours worked and ent.work done. Where do we new up the instance of timesheet entry? We don't. And that's a problem. Because the way that this works, a variable holds essentially the address to the house. So every instance of a class is kind of like a house being built from a blueprint. The class is the blueprint. Every time you say equals new, it's building a new house. And it's taking the blueprint and actually builds the real house. And the variable just holds where that street address is for that house. So this variable ent holds a street address for one instance of our class. Since we never said equals new timesheet entry again, we're still holding the same location of that address. When we add that address to our list, it essentially made a copy not of the object, but of the address for the object. So now ents, the list, has the street address of our class instance. But so does ent still. Therefore, they're talking about the same object. So when you set the hours worked and work done for that same location, you are overwriting what was already there. This is one of the dangers of reusing class instances. If you don't do it right, you break stuff. So in this case, there's a real easy fix. Ent equals new timesheet entry. Now we can assign the hours worked and work done. And you may say, well, wait a minute, aren't you overwriting that class instance? And the answer is no, because remember that ent is not storing the class instance. It's not storing the actual house, it's storing the address. So what I'm doing is saying, here's a new address to put into your variable. I create the new house, I grab the street address, and I put it into ent. So now let's fire this back up. I'm not going to put a breakpoint in here. I'm going to let it run and see if my changes make a difference. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. Yes. I worked for ABC Corp for 4 hours. No, I don't want to enter more time. All right. Acme, 5 hours times 150 is 750. That's right. ABC, 4 hours times 125 is 500. That's right. I get paid 90. 9 hours, 4 plus 5, 9 hours times $10 an hour is $90. That's right. Our whole application is working right. Or at least it's working right for this specific scenario. Let's try a few more. That's one of the other things that if you're newer to development, you'll be tempted to do is you'll be tempted to say, it works, push it to production. And that's not the way to approach building an application. I know that you want to get to the next thing. You want to move on. You've built it. But you've got to test all the edge cases. Now, this is where unit testing, and this application in general, would have really been amped up by unit testing. Unit testing would have found all these bugs, hopefully. And even if not, it would have made our job right now a whole lot easier. But we don't have that in place right yet. So what we do instead is we have to actually run it live, which is ugly, but we're making it work. So what we got to do now is actually figure out how to do the job of checking for other edge cases. And that's what unit testing you do is you unit test first for the, quote unquote normal stuff, but then you try out some weird things. Like, can you enter no time? Well, no, you have to enter time because it asks you right away for who you worked for and what time you entered. But there's some other things we can test for. So let's run this again. And the first thing I'll test for is working for Acme for more than one job. For 5 hours, yes, I worked for Acme again for 6 hours. Enter more time? Yeah, let's enter more time. In fact, I worked for Acme let's work for another 38 hours. That's a lot of time. But what it's going to do is going to push us over 40. So it's going to test kind of two things at once, which It may be stretching it to do that. I try not to. In fact, you know what? Let's wait. Let's do 4. That puts us only at 15 hours total, but it's 3 entries for Acme, and I'll do 1 for another company. Enter more time, yes. I just noticed that this says enter more time, whereas this one up here says enter more time, yes, no. Let's go ahead and mark that down and fix that later. Enter what you did. I worked for ZZZ Industries. I worked for 3 hours. So now my total time is 18 hours overall, 15 of which are for Acme. No more time. So I've billed Acme for $2,250, which if we take $15 or 15 hours, and multiply it by $150, you'll get $2,250. You might need a calculator for that. ABC, we didn't work at all, which actually allows us to test to make sure that that got $0, which it did. And I got paid $180. 18 hours times $10 an hour is $180. So that all worked. Very cool. Now, let's test it again. And this time we're going to say I worked for Acme for, let's do 5.5 hours. Whoops. I worked for Acme for 5.5 hours. And there's another exception. I figured that might come in. Because remember I saw that int.parse from the console read line? Well, we're storing things in integers, and that means they can't enter anything that is not a whole number. Now, there's a few things to address here. First one is, do we want to allow non-integer values? So can you work half an hour at a job? 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours, whatever. Now, from an employee standpoint, you kind of want to say no, right? Because you always round up to the nearest hour. At least that's what I would want to do. So if you work for 15 minutes, well, that's an hour. And that's great for getting paid. It's not so great for the employer. The employer is going to want to, dial you in right to the minute if they can, because they don't want to pay you for more than you're doing. So if you're only going to work 15 minutes, we're only going to pay you for 15 minutes. That means we can't say hours. At least not and make it whole numbers only. So there's a couple ways we can deal with this. One, let's scroll to the bottom to this class here. We could either change this to minutes worked, and then that could be a whole number. But that seems like it's problematic. Because think if we already had information in the database for people who've worked some time. If we change hours to be minutes instead, and they worked 4 hours, instead of getting paid $40, now they've worked 4 minutes, and they're going to get paid, what's $10 an hour times 4 minutes? I mean, that's a 15th of an hour. So you're talking they're going to get like pennies, and get less than $1 worth of money for what they used to get $40 for. So that doesn't seem like it's a good idea. So I think instead we should change this to be a double. But that has its own issues. Notice all the red squigglies. Now this application is nice in the fact that it's small. But if it's a larger application, we'd have a lot more to do. But for now, we'll just go ahead and address this as if it were a full application. So it's yelling at us here because it says hours worked, which is a double plus equal to TTL. Well, what's TTL? TTL, if we scroll up here, is an int. And notice this int I, t, TTL. That's actually a way of declaring 3 different integers on the same line. Not a fan of that, but that's how this programmer did it. Well, let's change this out by saying double TTL. All right, so now you just change that to be a double. If you scroll through, it looks like there's no more errors. Let's go ahead and build this. A build will tell you if you have any errors. We don't. That's great. But right down here, we have int.parse. It's actually up here too. So int.parse console readline, which is what threw the exception in the first place. And it's going to t, which is also an integer. Well, that's weird because we have an integer going into hours worked, which is double. Well, that's because integers actually convert into doubles without a problem. Think about it. A whole number could also be a decimal. It's just that it's, has nothing after the decimal. So that's actually doing a conversion behind the scenes now. So let's make this change as well. So given that they already have this format of doing a comma, I'm going to bite the bullet and do it myself. I'm not a big fan, but I am a big fan of converting to the standard that's already in use. Don't try and change it unless you can change it everywhere. All right, so I changed that to be a double, and I still have no exceptions, but I still have as int.parse. So let's change this to be a double.parse. And I know it's down here as well, int.parse. So double.parse. Let's see if that solves our problem. And here we did. I worked for Acme for 5.5 hours. No. And my bill is $825. And 5.5 times 150 is 825. So that's correct. And we got paid $55 for our time. That's because $10 an hour times 5.5 hours is $55. So it appears we've solved our problem. But what if we run it one more time? And I say, I worked for Acme. How long did I work for? A long time. Input string was not in the correct format. We get an exception. Remember I say don't trust the users. If you say, well, we're going to accept decimal or doubles, that means that we don't have to do any other kind of checks. That's not true. The user will type in something else. Now, probably they won't type in a very long time, but what they'll probably do is they'll accidentally hit enter, or they'll bump like the P key underneath the 0. And so they put 1P instead of 10. They'll do stuff like that, and that's what'll throw this type of exception. So let's see how we can address this issue. When we read it in, we're parsing it right away. Let's change that. So we already have a string W. Let's do a comma up here again to fill in the format. We're going to say we're going to give another string, but instead of calling it just a one letter thing, we're going to call it the raw time worked. All right? And that will be the string value of the time worked. So let's say raw time worked equals console.readline, and it's going to go into this right here. So instead of doing the parse here, right in line with the console readline, we're going to parse this value. But just parsing it will crash if it's not an actual number inside that string. So let's do something different. What if we said, while double dot try parse, and we'll say that our input string is raw time worked, and out double, let's actually say out t. Okay, so what's going to happen is, let's take this away now. We're going to check to see if try parse works. Remember that try parse returns a true or false. And so if this works, we actually want to say when it doesn't work. So we're going to say equals false. And I explain in other videos, but I do equals false instead of putting the exclamation point in front of double because it's a whole lot easier to see. So that's just, it compiles the same intermediate language. So there's no penalty as far as performance doing it this way, but there is a penalty as far as debugging performance when you're reading through it. So that's just something to think through. So if try parse, if it fails, it's going to equal false. So if it equals false, then do something in here. Otherwise, skip over. And the out is going to put a value into t, which is what we use as our temporary storage location for hours worked, the actual double of hours worked. So if it fails, what we're going to do is copy these two lines right here and paste them in here. How long do you do it for? And maybe we should do is do a console write line, an empty console write line, because we got a whole lot of stuff crunched in there. I'm going to put some extra spaces in here, again, making things a little better than I found it. And then I'm going to say console write line again, invalid number given. That's pretty clear. Invalid number given. And it's going to ask again how long you do it for. And it's going to, again, read that into raw time worked. We're going to come back up to the while top, and it's going to try and parse that value. If it works, then it's going to put the value into t, and it'll be true. Therefore, this will exit the while loop. If it does not work, we're going to say invalid number given and go back through again. So that way, we'll ensure that the user gets stuck in a loop until they give us valid information. Now, let's try this and make sure it actually works before we apply it down here as well. Because we have this double dot parse down here. We've got enough changes so far. Let's make sure they work first, and then we'll apply it later. Enter what you did. I worked for Acme. How long you do it for? Long time. Invalid number given. How long you do it for? A very long time. Invalid number given. How long you do it for? 5.8 hours. Do you want to enter more time? Nope. And there we go. So that worked. 870, 85, $0 for ABC. And it didn't crash. So let's take this code right here, and we're going to paste it down here because that's how you put the value into t now. So also notice that I'm copying and pasting code, which is really a code smell. A code smell is just something that you come across and you're like, that doesn't look right, that doesn't sound right, that doesn't smell right. There's something wrong here. And the thing that's wrong is we're repeating ourselves. And one of the very basic tenets of programming is don't repeat yourself. Okay, that's DRY, dry, as we call it. So our code is definitely not dry. But that's not what we're worrying about right now. We're not worried about refactoring. We're worrying about getting the code to work. Because working code is so much better than pretty code. All right, so let's try this. I worked for Acme for a long time. Nope. How about for 4.3 hours? Yes, I want to enter more time. I worked for ZZZ Inc. for a really long time. Nope. Now, why did I do that again? Because now in my my while loop, which is a different spot and different code. So I'm testing that code as well. How long do you work for? 8.8 hours. No more time. So 645 for Acme and 131 for me. All right, so that's working. So it appears as though I've got my code working, but I haven't tested all my scenarios yet. So let's look through all the different places where my code branches or I have checks, okay? And make sure you try both sides of a check and both sides of a branch. And let's look what that means. So right here is a check. Check to see if the work done contains Acme. So we've checked to make sure that it does pick up Acme. All right? But what we haven't checked for is what if I type all lowercase Acme? All right, and so let's check that right now. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. No. Acme gets a bill of $0. So that didn't work. Well, how do we fix that? Because we have it here, we have it here. Let's do this. Hours worked to lower contains all lowercase Acme. Let's see if it works first and apply it in other areas. I worked for Acme for 5 hours. No. Acme now gets billed for $750 correctly. Okay, so that fixed our problem. Now let's go ahead and change work done for ABC to be to lower. And also change ABC to be all lowercase. All right, and that's the only two checks we have where we're checking based upon a name. But let's make sure that works. So I worked for Acme for 5 hours. Yes, I worked for ABC for 4 hours. No. 750 and 500. There's 500, there's 750, and 90 overall. That's all correct. All right. Now again, remember I said that I wanted to take care of that, the while loop, not having that yes, no here. So let's take care of that while I'm thinking about it. Okay. So we've checked this branch, Acme. We've checked this branch with ABC. And there is no branch here for hours worked. Just adds it all up. But notice the if statement here. If total is greater than 40. We have not yet tried out our total greater than 40. So let's do it now. Let's say that I worked for Acme for 50 hours. No more time. $7,500 bill to Acme. That's correct. And I will get paid $750. Does that sound right? Well, 15 times our total, which was 50. That's correct. It's $750. But this may not translate across the globe. So, but at least in the United States, typically what we do is we work 40 hours a week. Is what we consider a normal work week. Now, a lot of us work more than that, but if you're getting paid per hour and you get work more than 40 hours, every hour above 40, you get paid time and a half. So if you get paid $10 an hour for your normal 40 hours a week, when you work the 41st hour, that 1 hour you get paid $15 instead of $10. So the first 40 is $400. the next hour, $15, would mean overall you get paid $415. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, what we've got is we're taking the total and multiplying it by time and a half. So this seems like a bad calculation because if I worked 50 hours, I should be getting paid for 40 of them at $10 an hour. It's $400. And the last 10 at $15, which means $150. I should be getting paid $550. Instead, I'm multiplying the entire thing by $15, which means we're giving them time and a half for all the hours, including the first 40. So that's not right. So we got to fix this calculation. So we've identified the purpose of our code and we know what breaks it. Anything over 40 breaks the normal calculation. So let's put in a solution. So the total, let's do this. If it's over 40, we know it's over 40. Therefore, we can say the total minus 40 times 15. So that'd be anything over 40 times 15. And we'll wrap that whole thing in parens and say plus 40 times 10. And I just hard code 40 there because that's the first 40 hours. All right. So we have the total minus 40. So that'd be, if we had 50 in here, that's 50 minus 40 is 10 times 15 plus 40 times 10, which is the original $400. Now let's make sure I'm going to put extra parens here just to make sure that it would have worked correctly because of the order of operations, I believe. But I don't want to make any guesses on this. So I'm wrapping this section right here in parens. Therefore, I know that's going to be, first calculate this, which is 10. Then calculate 10 times 15, because that's inside these parens. And then add that to calculate this, 40 times 10. So there's a lot of parens there. They may not strictly be necessary, but I know for sure that it will perform the order of operations in the order that I want it to. So let's check to make sure this works. Remember that $50 or 50 hours should be 40 times 10 is 400 plus 40 times $10 an hour is $400. And then $15 an hour times the remaining 10 hours is $150. Therefore, it's $550. That's our total. I worked for Acme for 50 hours. No. I got paid $550. That looks right. So now I have validated that I'm getting paid right, Acme's getting billed right, and so is ABC. We've also tested all of our different branches. So there's a branching there. If this, then do this, else do that. And we've tested our different scenarios, like we pull out just ABC stuff or just Acme stuff. We've tested to make sure that, what happens when you pass in invalid data in all the different spots, and that seems to work correctly now. And we've, put in checks so that if they give us invalid data, we keep asking until they give us correct valid data, or, as in this case up here, anything other than a yes is an assumed no. All right. And so all this stuff adds up to, it looks like our application is finally working the way it should. We've eliminated all those different bugs. But remember, again, it's like rolling those windows up in the car. Just fixing one didn't solve our entire application's problems. We had to fix a lot and keep coming back and keep picking at it and keep trying things. And even after it seemed like it worked, we had to try all those edge scenarios to make sure that it continued to work because it didn't. It broke. So we gave it bad data, or we gave it non-integer data for those hours worked and stuff like that. It broke our application. So just making sure that you try all those different things. And again, if you were writing unit tests, you would now have those tests for all those different scenarios written, because that's how you check to make sure that's going to work. And if you have those tests written, now you have them forever. And so whenever you make any changes to this application, you would know to continue to work because your tests continue to pass. And if they don't pass, you know you've made a mistake in how you refactor. So again, watch the unit test video, kind of get used to that idea, because that's the way you want to move forward as a developer. But that's outside the scope of what we're doing here, because here we're simulating the idea that you walked into a scenario, probably at your job, but maybe, just debugging a normal application where you have to fix something in order to get your application back up and running, but you don't have time to redo the entire application. You don't have time to rebuild the entire thing. You just need to understand what it's doing and fix the problem. This is an incredibly common scenario. So the more you practice this, the more you work on it, the better off you'll be. So here's a big piece of advice. When you come across a bug, don't treat it as an, oh no, what did I do wrong? Treat it as an opportunity to practice. Embrace it. Enjoy it. Now, I know that fixing bugs is not fun, and sometimes you bang your head against the desk. I know I have for years. But fixing bugs is important and it's necessary. So don't turn to somebody else. Don't ask somebody else if they don't know how to fix it. Don't reach out to somebody via email and say, can you fix this for me? Don't post on Stack Overflow, here's my problem. Don't do any of those things until after you have spent a lot of time trying to debug and diagnose the problem. Spend days if you have to, tracking down the issue, picking at it one step at a time. Use your breakpoints. Use your reading of the code. Do everything you can to try and figure out what the code is doing and why it's not behaving the way you expect. Because the more you can do that, the better you will be at debugging. The better you'll be at debugging means the better you'll be as a developer. When I'm hiring developers and I'm looking for someone who might be a little less experienced, there's one thing that I look for, and that's how do you problem solve? Because it's understandable that you don't know all the topics in C#. It's understandable that you're not on the cutting edge. You don't know everything. No one does. I'm convinced that nobody knows the full breadth and scope of C# except maybe a couple guys at Microsoft. But if you can fix problems by diagnosing them properly and by working through your progression of figuring out why something's happening, then you're going to be fine. It's the people who will come to me every time and say, I have a problem. Can you fix it for me? I have a problem. Can you fix it for me? Those are the people that I don't hire, because all they're going to do is utilize my debugging skills to fix their problem, which means they'll never grow at debugging themselves. And since the majority of programming is fixing bugs, that means the majority of their time is going to be spent making me do their work. Well, why do I have that developer in my company if they're just going to make me do their work? I'm going to find somebody who can debug well, because the better you can debug, the better you will grow as a developer, the better you'll be prepared for scenarios that you're not yet understanding how they work. You can still debug. I will gladly teach you new concepts, and that's what I do for my employees. I teach them new concepts, but I really don't want to have them coming back to me and saying, can you debug my work? Because that's unless they have done an awful lot of work themselves, most likely that's just, again, sucking my time down. Now, there's going to get to a point where you get stuck and you've tried everything. Yes, reach out. Get help. I am not against you getting help. In fact, that's a really important part of programming, is working with others and getting that help. That's not the issue. The issue is when you get the help. And that's one of the things that people often get frustrated about Stack Overflow, because they say, well, the people were mean to me. The people were grumpy, or they, shut down my question. Most likely the reason why is not because they were just grumpy, mean people. Now, there's some of those out there, but the majority is because you didn't ask a good question. You did not show that you've spent the time debugging. Instead, what you showed was, I want you to do my debugging for me. Now, that may not have been the case. You may have done your work first, but at least that's what you showed. And so if you've done your work, you can kind of show that and say, these are the steps I've tried. I've stepped through the breakpoints. I've looked at all the variables. I still can't understand why this is happening. At that point, you transition from a person who is just asking for free work to a person who's saying, I'm a fellow developer who's stuck. And people love to help fellow developers who are stuck. Okay? So that's my piece of advice, is spend as much time as you can debugging and embrace the idea that you have an exception. Don't just freak out. Instead, go through the 5 steps. Don't panic. Read that error message. Identify the purpose of the code where it broke. Figure out what breaks that code. And then find a new solution where the code doesn't break. So do those 5 steps over and over and over again until you have no more bugs that you've found. And at that point, again, just keep trying those edge cases to make sure that you're as rock solid as possible in your code. Okay? So that's it for this lesson. Again, this is not a complete good application yet. We are going to spend another lesson on this code, refactoring it. Now, they come up in a couple of weeks. We won't do it next week because I want to get some other things out of the way first in preparation for that. But we'll come back to that and get some refactoring done in this application to make it a more appropriate or a better application. Okay? So until then, stay tuned. Make sure that you subscribe and click that bell to get notified when new videos come out. And as always, I am Tim Corey.